From the Missouri School of Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. We're going to look ahead at a really interesting presidential runoff that's happening in the South American nation of Ecuador on April 2nd. And for the past decade, Ecuador has been led by President Rafael Correa, a leftist leader who molded himself after Venezuela's Hugo Chavez. Correa hasn't been afraid to use fiery anti-U.S. rhetoric or tweak Western governments by granting asylum to WikiLeaks' Julian Assange in Ecuador's London embassy. But now Correa is term limited out of office. Polls show that Lenin Moreno, his chosen successor, is running neck and neck with the center-right candidate Guillermo Lasso. Now, unlike Venezuela, which lies in economic ruin, Ecuador's economy has done fairly well over the last decade. Oil revenues have helped the government reduce the poverty rate from 37% in 2007 to 23% in 2015, according to the World Bank. Yet polls show the race is very, very close. The opposition has blamed Correa and Moreno for growing corruption in the country. Correa has also been criticized for acting in an authoritarian manner. He's known for publicly harassing and criticizing reporters who publish unflattering news, and rights groups have accused him of making Ecuador's court system a political arm of his government. Now, in a minute, we'll hear more about Correa's legacy and what it means for this election from a panel of experts. But first, we're joined from the capital, Quito, by Carolina Loza-Leon. She's an Ecuadorian journalist who has reported for outlets including Public Radio International and the New York Times. Carolina, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's great to have you. So we're looking at this runoff election between Moreno from the ruling party and the opposition candidate Guillermo Lasso. This comes after a first round of voting in February where there's a fair amount of drama. Tell us just a bit about what happened during the first round of elections.
Well, the first round, this country, since Correa was in power, there was a lot of instability. So there was no surprise Correa would win on a first round. And his party, Alianza PAIS, was expecting to win on a first round, which is very unlikely considering that there's no leader after 10 years that can level up to Correa's popularity. So as results started coming in and there was a tight, a very close difference, very narrow difference between Lasso and Moreno, delays in the National Electoral Council made a lot of people wary of what the results were, and if it was a process that was following all the rules, to put it that way. So many people took it on the street to protest in major cities across the country, and Moreno was not able to reach the 40% vote and the 10-point difference needed to win on a first round.
So you mentioned, under the Ecuador's electoral rules, in the first round of elections, there's many different candidates running, and if any one candidate reaches the 40% threshold and is ahead of the second place candidate by 10 percentage points or more, then they're declared the winner and there's no need for a runoff election. And Lenin Moreno of the ruling party, he just narrowly missed that.
Narrowly missed it. So it's a very dramatic result. You have a very divided society after 10 years of Correa in power, and it is quite divided. You had other candidates that now are trying to figure out who they're going to support, if Moreno or Lasso. So you have all those votes, and it's an uphill battle for both candidates to win those votes that they missed on the first round for the runoff.
And tell us about the mood of people on the ground in Ecuador now. Is it tense? Is it exciting? Are people fairly calm?
It's a bit tense. I would say it's back. The electoral campaign is back on. A lot of people are still undecided of who they're going to vote for. It has been throughout the country. I would speak to people and they were undecided who they vote for. And it seems that the tone of the election is set on either support for Correa or against Correa. So it's either an anti-Correa vote or a pro-Correa vote. It's not a vote based on policies or new proposals by candidates. And Lasso is certainly not a fresh new candidate into the political arena in Ecuador. So it's the failures and the current climate in the country is what sets the tone for the election rather than a new alternative.
So it sounds like it's very much a referendum on President Correa. The opposition candidate, Guillermo Lasso, finished second to him 4 years ago, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes, he finished, but it was a very different tone back then. It was he accepted the results straight away. There was no contesting the electoral results. It was a smooth process. And Correa still has a very high popularity. If you think about it, 10 years of Correa he has not been able to find a successor as popular as he is. And it seems the party and his 10 years in power had been about him. If you think about how you call Correa supporters are Correistas, it's not the party, it's Correa as the person. So it's going to be very hard to follow that without this figure in power.
And I wanted to ask you about sort of President Correa's legacy. He has been criticized quite widely by human rights groups, by press freedom groups, for his treatment of the media, for his treatment of other sort of peaceful critics. I think at one point Correa called the private media, his greatest enemy. Talk to us just a little bit about the climate for reporters and for the press in Ecuador.
Well, over the years, Correa first started with a stance of how the elections, I'm sorry about that. Correa basically started criticizing the media and its role, the private media, and set up public news outlets. That was a new idea back then, and it seemed like a very good way to diversify voices in media. However, over the years, he has taken more of an authoritarian role, criticizing media practices, but also criticizing articles and journalists who oppose him. That has been exacerbated over the past few years, I would say. And the climate is a climate of fear for reporters, I would say, that with several lawsuits in some cases, against a couple of newspapers. There has been a climate of fear and a chilling effect for journalists. In fact, there are many that are afraid to speak. And it's just not just the journalists, but anyone who talks to the press. So many of the times you go reporting in the field, people are very afraid to speak, from public servants to people on the streets. If you want to talk, there's a fear. There's usually are you one of Correa's people? What does this mean for me if I give declarations? And it can be something as lighthearted as how you feel about the government, how you feel about Correa, that makes people wary. So it's a climate of fear that has bleed on the press, and I would say beyond into civil society.
And you mentioned that there have been a number of lawsuits by President Correa, by the ruling party, against journalists, against newspapers. What kinds of articles, what kinds of reporting is leading to this?
Many of the first lawsuits, one was a book written about possible corruption, and it involved his brother. It was called the Gran Hermano case by two investigative journalists in Ecuador. That was later dropped. They were pardoned. Also, but it's interesting because it's not just the articles that can be written. There was an opinion piece that was also one of the cases del Universo after the attempted coup against Correa. But besides that, there's a lot of crackdown on the press with the new communications law. And for instance, some of the newspapers such as Hoy were cracked down for not paying their employees on time, or investigative magazine Vanguardia was shut down because they weren't clear in how many numbers were print of the magazine were print. So it's not just the articles that would get a news outlet in trouble, but it's also little areas such as print issues or payments that have gotten opposition news outlets in trouble before. So it seems as a disguised way of cracking down on the media.
Well, Carolina Loza-Leon, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
A reminder that you're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. We're talking today about the April 2nd presidential runoff in Ecuador, where President Rafael Correa is stepping down after 10 years in office. There, Correa's chosen leftist successor, Lenin Moreno, is in a tight race with the center-right opposition candidate, Guillermo Lasso. To broaden our discussion, we're going to bring in three other people who have been following the race closely. Joining us from Quito is Carla González. She's a reporter for TeleSur, a satellite news network owned by a group of Latin American governments, including Ecuador, Venezuela, and Cuba. And joining us from Caracas, Venezuela, is Alexandra Ulmer. She's a South America reporter for Reuters who recently traveled to Ecuador to cover the first round of polling. And joining us in Washington, D.C. is John Polga Hekimovich. He's a professor of comparative politics and researches Latin America at the U.S. Naval Academy. Welcome to all of you. Let me start with you, Alexandra Ulmer. One of the issues in this election is government corruption, and that's something that Correa, when he came to power a decade ago, had run hard against sort of a corrupt elite. But recently, Transparency International gave their annual rankings and ranked Ecuador as the third most corrupt country in South America. So what can you tell us about the issue of corruption right now in Ecuador and how it's shaping this election?
Hi, Jason. That's a very good question. Corruption has become one of the key items in the campaign. There are two big corruption scandals covering Ecuador at the moment. One of them is the Latin America-wide Odebrecht scandal. It recently came out in a plea bargain that Odebrecht had paid around $30 million.
And sorry, Odebrecht, they're a Brazilian construction company, is that right?
Yes, exactly. Thanks for specifying. And they basically engaged in a pattern of bribes across Latin America, including in Ecuador. And the opposition says the public prosecutor in Ecuador has been slow to investigate the corruption. In parallel, there's also a corruption scandal at the state-owned oil company that has affected the leftist government.
And those, and who are some of the people that have been implicated in these scandals?
Both investigations are underway. There's a fugitive oil minister who has been accused of corruption, who has in turn been posting very dramatic videos on YouTube accusing people in the government of being fully aware and complicit in corruption, and also implicating Lenin Moreno's running mate, Jorge Glass, who is the current vice president, which is very uncomfortable for the governing party and has turned some voters away from Moreno.
And Carla González of TeleSur, let me turn this to you. We just heard Alexandra talking about corruption here. What are the main differences between Correa and his chosen successor, Lenin Moreno? Are the two almost indistinguishable?
Well, for my opinion, it's not about saying that if Correa should continue or not, or analyzing his government. It's more about the division between a right-wing candidate and a left-wing candidate. It's Moreno, this very social-aimed candidate, against a right-wing banker who was part of a government that was involved in the largest banking crisis in the country. And I think it's more about continuing the social gains of the government. The vote that we just had was about that. If people decide if they want Lenin to continue all the good things that the government has done, or if they want a complete change in another perspective. I think most of the allegations of corruption, and you mentioned this this poll that said that Ecuador was one of the most corrupt countries. This was just a perception poll. Even the government of Correa has been the first one to denounce more than 130 cases in its government and has continued to fight against corruption. Even Moreno said that during the campaign, that he will find and prosecute every person that is involved in corruption, even if it's part of his government. These corruption allegations even turn back to Lasso himself, Guillermo Lasso from the right wing. He was part of the banking crisis, and he is involved in at least 39 companies that were involved in the Panama Papers scandal. And Correa's government has been very tough on this and has led a global campaign against tax havens. It even passed in the last elections. It was not only for president. Ecuadorians also voted to include that people that were elected, officials that were elected, could not have their money in tax havens, which would be a very tough challenge if Lasso wants to be president, because he has to return all his money back to Ecuador.
And so you referenced, in a way, how the ruling party has responded to some of these allegations of corruption. They have criticized Guillermo Lasso, the opposition candidate, who is a banker, for his involvement in a conservative government in the 1990s. Let me turn this, though, to you, John Polga Hekimovich. Correa's party did win the most seats in Ecuador's parliament in the elections that took place in February. How is this going to affect whoever the new president is, especially if the opposition candidate, Guillermo Lasso, does win? How effectively will he be able to govern, given that Correa's leftists will effectively have a big voice in the parliament?
Hi, Jason. Thank you. That's a great question. So Alianza PAIS to the best of my knowledge, has gained, I believe, 74 out of the 137 seats in the National Assembly, which means that Correa's party would hold about 55% of the National Assembly. That means that if Lenin Moreno from the governing party wins the runoff election, that he would have a majority, a legislative majority, to be able to essentially pursue his agenda. On the other hand, if Guillermo Lasso wins, that could spell some trouble for governance in Ecuador. His Creo Suma alliance has only 34 seats in the assembly, which is does not even approach 50%. So this is due to a very particular two particular constitutional articles in Ecuador's 2008 constitution. They're referred to as muerte cruzada, or crossed death. The first of these is Article 130, which says that essentially the National Assembly can remove the President of the Republic with a favorable two-thirds vote. And the other article is 148, which specifies that the President can dissolve the National Assembly when, in his or her opinion, it has taken up duties that do not pertain to it under the Constitution, and a number of other things. What this essentially means is, if there's gridlock or deadlock in Congress, either the President or the National Assembly can dissolve the other branch of government, which would trigger early elections. So it's essentially like a parliamentary mechanism that is introduced constitutionally in this presidential system.
So effectively, the president can try to fire the parliament, and the parliament can fire the president in some circumstances, it sounds like, which is interesting. Alexandra, Ulmer, if I can turn that to you, because this has been a very contentious campaign. It does sound like Ecuador is quite divided. You are based in Venezuela, where an opposition conservative candidate did win the presidency, and did win the parliament, and yet you have a leftist president still. So there has been a divided government there that has resulted in what looks like, from the outside at least, an ongoing political crisis. Is that something that's likely to happen also in Ecuador?
Well, I think the Venezuela situation is very particular to this country. There's a big ongoing political crisis in which the president has basically sidelined the National Assembly that is opposition dominated in the midst of a major economic crisis. Now Ecuador's economy contracted last year, and it's also a very polarized society. But I don't think we're anywhere close to a Venezuela situation yet. As John rightly points out, though, there could be some governability challenges if Lasso does win. The mood I got from Ecuadorians is that many of them really believed in Correa, wanted more equality, wanted more environmental protection, wanted a crackdown on corruption, and many have ended up disappointed. Jobs are the big issue there. That said, Lasso, as a conservative former banker, doesn't excite many people, especially disillusioned Correa supporters. So it's a pretty low enthusiasm campaign, and I think the fact that it's a divided country and the result in the National Assembly could make it tricky for whoever becomes president.
A quick reminder that you're listening to Global Journalist. We're talking today about the tight presidential race in Ecuador, where leftist President Rafael Correa is stepping aside after 10 years in office. For more Global Journalist, you can visit our website, globaljournalist.org. There you'll find our ongoing coverage of underreported international news and human rights issues. You can also check out Global Journalist on Facebook or Twitter, or subscribe to the videocast of this program on YouTube. Carla González, let me turn this to you. After the first round of elections in Ecuador in February, there was a lot of discussion about fraud in the election and whether or not the electoral process itself was legitimate. Are we seeing that those same concerns are being raised about the runoff election now? What's likely to happen in that vein?
Well, we saw the first round of elections that Lenin Moreno was very close to achieving that 40% of votes to win in one round. Only Rafael Correa has done so. He has had enough votes to win in one round. And it's very common for elections in Ecuador to go to a second round. He actually did get that 10% difference with Guillermo Lasso. So I think the narrative of Guillermo Lasso and his party has been to allege a fraud in case they lose in the second round. Only one of the five exit polls after the elections said that Lenin did not win in first round. So I think the more that we see people talking about this, we figured out that, well, there hasn't been any official complaints about fraud. We've had more than 100 observers during the elections, not only national, but international. And I think the right wing has tried to discredit not only the official institutions, but to actually call for violence. And when we saw after the first round that they called to burn down Quito, the capital of Ecuador, if the votes did not go the way that they wanted. And I think these elections are more about the stability, the political stability that Ecuador has had. In the last years, we've had several presidents throughout years. We have one president that even lasted only 6 months. So I think it's more about continuing that political stability that has led to Correa's government lifting more than 2 million people out of poverty and instaurating public health, free education, and that's the main difference with the right wing here.
So in other words, these concerns about fraud during the first round of the election by the ruling party were somewhat alleviated by the fact that Lenin Moreno, the ruling party candidate, very, very narrowly missed winning the presidency by, I believe it was less than 1 percentage point. But let me turn this to you, John Polga-Hekimovic. Many of our listeners are familiar with the case of Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks. He's been in Ecuador's embassy in London for about 5 years now, living in asylum to escape an arrest warrant. What would this election mean for him and for his case?
Well, that's very interesting. It's speculating. Guillermo Lasso has already come out and said if he's elected, he essentially would revoke the asylum that Julian Assange has at the Ecuadorian embassy in London. And on the other hand, Moreno has commented less on it, but we could probably expect a continuation of policy from that of under Correa. That means that Assange is probably hoping that Moreno wins. Now, even having said that, Moreno is a more moderate politician than Correa is. And so there even is a possibility under a Moreno government that Assange will be looking for a new home or could be extradited.
Well, let me turn this back to you, Alexandra. Ulmer, we did receive a question via Twitter from Carmen in Spain, who said that this race was really unequal and that with Lasso, the opposition candidate, is in effect running sort of on his own against the power of the state. You were in Ecuador reporting recently. Did you see that the sort of power of the bureaucracy of the government is being used to help re-elect Rafael Correa's successor?
Well, there's no doubt that Alianza PAIS, the ruling party, has a big machine behind it and has a lot of support and has done big grassroots efforts in some of Ecuador's more isolated provinces. The opposition also hurt itself by dividing in the first round. There were 8 candidates running in February, 1 from the ruling party and 7 from the opposition. And some of the opposition leaders were part of kind of small-scale, relatively new parties without that much support. Yes, the opposition says the playing field is unfair and that Correa has amassed a lot of power in institutions. But they say that they're confident that they will win, given that the tide has turned against Correa, and around 60-70% of Ecuadorians now oppose his government, according to the opposition. The ruling party, of course, says the opposition is histrionic and accusing the government of having an unfair playing field simply because they're not popular enough and they haven't been able to campaign effectively.
And Carla González, if I could turn you back to the issue of Julian Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy in London, is this something that resonates at all with ordinary Ecuadorians? Do people care about this, or are they voting more on bread and butter issues?
Of course, they're voting on bread and butter issues, but they're also worried about sovereignty issues that Correa has raised since he came to office. We saw Guillermo Lasso saying that if he wins, he will kick out Assange. And we saw Moreno, on the other hand, talking about sovereignty. In Ecuador, we demand sovereignty from other countries. So we're asking, at least Moreno was asking the same thing to Assange, which was seen as him saying that he would probably kick him out, but it's not like that. He's just asking if we're asking the US or other countries to be respectful for political issues that happen in Ecuador, we also want to respect what happens abroad. We're not saying that Assange shouldn't be working from our embassy, but it's a part of balancing respect for other countries as well. And I think the polls have showed that Lenin Moreno, which has led the fight to respect people with disabilities, because we saw a lot of discrimination with people with disabilities in Ecuador, and he had led that fight, that I think that is reflected on the recent poll that says that Moreno could win with 15.4% difference against Lasso.
And you raised an interesting point about Lenin Moreno and disabilities. He is a paraplegic in a wheelchair after being shot in a robbery, I believe, in the late 1990s. But John Polga Hekimovich, let me turn this to you. We heard Carla talking just a little bit about Ecuador's relations with the U.S. And with Western powers vis-a-vis Julian Assange. How are those relationships likely to change after this election if Guillermo Lasso, the opposition candidate, wins, or if Lenin Moreno, Correa's chosen successor, wins?
Well, Lasso has publicly stated that he would pursue increased relations with the United States, reestablishing a number of economic ties that have been stunted under the Correa government. And Moreno has actually even publicly stated that he would like to improve relations with the United States. Now, that being said, I think the big difference is in their relationship to not to the United States, but rather to China. Correa has definitely made it an important part of his strategy, his economic strategy, to seek loans and improve commercial ties with China during his 10 years in office. And Moreno would do the same thing. What Lasso would do with regards to China is less clear, I think.
And Alexandra, Ulmer, our time does grow short. There was a piece in the New York Times recently describing sort of a malaise in the left in South America. And we've seen that in Argentina, in Brazil, leftist governments have been kicked out. In Venezuela, obviously, there's sort of an ongoing political crisis. Do you see that this is sort of the last stand of this sort of new left in Latin America?
That's one of the key questions for regional politics at the moment. So basically, there's a very strong leftist bloc that dominated much of South American politics for the last decade, while the region was experiencing a major commodities boom propelled by China. And Latin America is very rich in oil, copper, soy, and all sorts of other commodities. So as prices rose, we underwent a big economic boom here that was mostly overseen by leftist governments in Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, Argentina, and Brazil, and Venezuela, of course. And that's not a completely homogeneous bloc. There are big variations. And what we've basically seen, as you mentioned, is that in Argentina, Brazil, and Peru have all lost leftist governments in the last 18 months. As the economies decelerate across the region, unrest and discontent grows, and amid emerging corruption scandals.
I'm sorry, Alexandra, we're just out of time. I'm going to have to cut you off there. That's going to do it for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Missouri School of Journalism and KBIA Mid-Missouri Public Radio. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for listening.